today for the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 annual meeting. Welcome back to everyone who joined us this morning. We had an excellent opening session today on trade and supply chains, and we're very fortunate to be joined by IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, who I'm sure will be sharing some more thoughts on this and other critical topics in her discussion with John today. I'll be very brief so that we can turn it over to them. The theme of this year's conference is confronting changes and adapting to new economic realities. And there is no shortage of those facing the world right now. This week's meetings are taking place against a turbulent economic and geopolitical backdrop and really a confluence of crises. I don't want to keep the managing director waiting, so just a reminder to our audience that we will reserve time for questions at the end, so that if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A function, and we'll collect those and then we'll call on you towards the end of the conversation. As I said, the managing director is with us. She really needs no introduction to this audience, nor does our vice chair, Mr. John Lipsky. So John, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to kick off our discussion with the MD.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And thanks in particular to the Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, for taking time out of what is the busiest, one of the two busiest weeks of the year to share her views with us, with the Bretton Woods Committee membership. Very much appreciated and welcome. Managing Director, this day began with the unveiling of the latest World Economic Outlook forecast. So I'm sure it's appropriate to begin this discussion with your views about the latest permutations and interpretations of the IMF staff about the challenges before us. Managing Director, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you for the invitation. It is one of my favorite segments of these two busiest weeks of the year, because I know I'm speaking to an audience that is competent, understands the institutions, and cares about their role. Let me start by stating the obvious, that since October, the outlook has worsened. Why? Because we live through a time when we deal with a crisis upon a crisis. We still have the pandemic impacting the world economy, and on top of it, we have the war in Ukraine that has created significant spillovers across the world. The COVID impact has already been visible in January, when we revised downwards our projections, and now we are doing this for a second time, more significantly than the first. We finished 2021 with the hope that we are on a path to sound recovery. Growth in 2021 was in the end 6.1%, not trivial. But then we downgraded projections to now 3.6% for 2022. And we also downgraded slightly our projections for next year. So next year we project again 3.6% rather than a bit 0.2 points more. This is primarily due to the impact of the war. Why? Because we have dramatic shrinkage of Ukraine. That is on top of the tragedy of people there, loss of lives, and tremendous displacement, with refugees across borders and internal displacements now exceeding 11 million people. Plus, of course, destructions across the board, infrastructure gone, and businesses interrupted. That it is bad. So for Ukraine, some 35% shrinkage this year. it's also a very bad year for Russia, where since October, we are downgrading growth by 11%. But it is also quite negatively impacting the neighboring countries, those that are more dependent on exports of fuels and foods and metals from Russia and also from Ukraine. And through impact on inflation, this has a spillover that is going fast and far. So let me say a couple of words on inflation. We were faced with it before the war. We know that interruption of supply chains and the fact that in some places a booming economy pushed demand, but supply didn't catch up, led to a accelerated inflation. Now the fuel and food prices in particular have put inflation in many countries on steroids. So we have a clear and present inflationary danger in many places. Just to get you to the numbers, we project inflation for advanced economies at 5.7% for this year, for emerging markets and developing economies at 8.7%. And we know that the spillovers are particularly severe when it comes down to energy security and food security. Food security is becoming top of mind concern. Why? Because even before the war, there were bad harvests in a number of places, mostly due to climate events. And now when you take out part of Ukrainian and Russian exports and you put a big question mark, what is going to happen with the next harvest, that is hitting some parts of the world, North Africa, parts of Africa, all the way to Indonesia, in a way that is really painful. So to sum it up, what we want to go up, growth, has gone down. What we want to go down, inflation, has gone up. In human terms, we are in a situation in which incomes are shrinking, but hardship is jumping, especially for poor people, and especially for poor people in poor countries. So the natural focus on policymakers is to deal with the threat of inflation decisively and early, because we know when you don't have price stability, that undermines growth as well. But as they deal with inflation, inevitably, that makes another problem that the pandemic has elevated, that much more severe. In 2020, the world borrowed extensively for a good reason, to put a floor under the world economy. It was the highest increase in debt since the Second World War. In 2021, for most countries, servicing this debt was not a problem. Why? Interest rates very low, monetary policy accommodative. For some countries, it costed them less to service large debt in 2021. No more the case in 2022. And in that sense, we are particularly worried for countries that are in that distress already and are now deprived of some of instruments like the debt service suspension initiative that was there for them until the end of 2021, in a year when they need help even more than at that point. So when we look at this picture, we should not forget the neighboring countries to Russia and Ukraine. Why? Remittances, flow of refugees an overall worsening of economic climate. So if that was not enough, John, you add to it the risk of fragmentation in the world economy, the slippage towards regional blocks or other formations in which reserve currencies, payment systems, trade, supply chains are all disrupted. And how is this world going to function is a very big question mark. We know after the war there would be changes. What would they be, and how we make sure that they are not significantly reducing the opportunities for well-being of people? That is a big question for us during this week.
Well, thank you for that very succinct and pointed summary of the outlook. And of course, it's a concerning one, not only for the latest changes, but I presume if there are risks, there's still plenty of risk for slower growth, but higher inflation. In other words, the likely causes of additional slowdown are not going to solve the inflation problem. If anything, make it worse. You've mentioned the impact on low-income countries that we can see coming. Already, as you've mentioned, and you can find in IMF publications, the burden of debt service as a percent of government revenues has increased 4 times faster in low-income countries than in advanced economies. We can see debt problems coming. The G20 has created the common framework to attempt to deal with these problems, with the need for reprofiling or restructuring of debt of low-income countries, now that the debt suspension initiative, the DSSI, has come to an end. But the common framework doesn't seem to be making much progress. How do you assess the current effort, and what seems to be holding things up? And is the common framework going to be adequate for dealing the problems that we can see coming in low-income countries?
The picture is indeed gloomier in terms of risks, tilted very much to the downside. And we are in an exceptionally uncertain environment. We don't know how long the war is going to last. We don't know where it would get more dramatic, triggering more sanctions. We don't know whether the climate would play us a surprise, that is another shock, whether we might see COVID resurfacing, doing yet another round around the world. All of this makes it for a kind of a lower business confidence, lower consumer confidence. We see it, some of it in the data, and you're right, that may trigger even further slow down. We may be lucky, maybe we would have a upswing, but one thing we know for sure, inflation has to be put under wraps. Major central banks do have to act, and act decisively. In quite a number of countries, the picture is such that not taking action can de-anchor inflation expectations, and then we may be in a very difficult place. So what does it mean? It means that debt service is going up, up, and up. And as you rightly said, this is particularly troubling for low-income countries in debt distress or near debt distress. You know the numbers. You actually, the Bretton Woods Committee has taken this topic to heart. You co-authored a very thoughtful paper on this topic. What we see are 3 issues. The first issue is how to help countries act early on their debt situation? In other words, what incentives are there for them? Well, the obvious incentive is your revenues are being melted by debt service, but this is not enough when countries look around and they're not sure there is appropriate avenue to pursue. Why? Because the common framework has not yet delivered on the expectations we built for it. Only 3 countries asked for a treatment under the common framework. None of this is completed. And until those are completed, everybody else is in a wait and see position. The second problem is that even if the common framework were to bring closure on 1, 2, 3, all 3 cases, it has demonstrated that it needs to be improved. It has to be more timely and predictable. So if you ask for it, you know how the process is going to go. Yes, you know a bit about the process, but there is no timeline that you can count on. 2, the incentive to participate could be much stronger if countries, once they ask for the common framework, can lean back to debt service suspension. And we have been recommending it, and it's kind of, so far, unfortunately, it looks like it's falling on a deaf ear. And 3, we believe that we cannot just look at the universe of DSSI eligible countries. What about countries like Sri Lanka, that is not a DSSI, but is now in a situation of debt, basically defaulting on debt and needing debt restructuring? There is, of course, also the big issue of creditor coordination, information sharing at par with each other, more transparency around the issue of debt, that also needs to be addressed. So even if we have the 3 cases resolved, we still need to improve the common framework for especially what we are likely to see as a more dramatic situation. And the third issue is when we have cases where the private sector is the bulk of the obligations of a country, how to make sure that the private sector is compelled to participate. They are included in the common framework, but it is still not quite clear that we have equal footing private sector participation. So what we want to see is large creditors like China, like the private sector, that they take more proactive approach to an issue that is going to hit not only the debtors, it is already going to hit the creditors as well. In our view, we have to continue from the IMF to zero in on clear debt sustainability analysis that can offer a pathway to debt resolution, and then try to bring everybody to participate early. Otherwise, we are paralyzed. When that is not sustainable, we simply cannot step forward and help countries. And some of these countries are under debt crisis and under a food crisis and under energy crisis, all at the same time.
Well, thank you for that. That's again very, very succinct and clear, and we certainly, our analysis coincides with your own, and we hope that the common framework evolves into something really effective. And it's our view at the Bretton Woods Committee that it's going to require what we call procedural transparency. How you described as predictability as to what's going to happen. We're hopeful that the IMF will be allowed to provide leadership in helping to form that procedural transparency and to help make this process work, because it's going to be very, very necessary, as you point out. Now, let me move on to an allied topic, and that is one of the initiatives of the fund that was just approved was the creation of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. This is the idea that the fund needs some longer-term money and hopes to fund that for low-income countries using some of the SDR allocation that went to advanced economies. How's that going? And what's the prospect for success?
Well, to finish on the previous topic, at the IMF, we are concerned about the direction on the issue of debt, especially for low-income countries, but not just for them, for countries that are already in a very difficult place. I mean, think of Lebanon, think of Sri Lanka, just to name two. And we would like to play the role that the international community sees as appropriate for us. I like the procedural predictability you're describing. How did you call it? Procedural
transparency, we call
transparency. Sorry, I
same idea. Same idea.
Yes, and I do think that we have no time to waste. It is not a matter of years; it is a matter of months. We have to move. Going to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, we have promised during the annual meetings that we will strive to have the design approved by the spring meetings. And at that time, I would admit I was a bit anxious because it is new for the fund. But the IMF staff delivered, and they delivered also because there was quite a lot of support outside of the IMF for this instrument. Why? Because very clearly macroeconomic and financial stability do need to be placed in a context of structural transformation and the right policies to support it. So if we are to play a role in getting countries to build more competitive economies that are greener, that are digital, that are more resilient to shocks of all kinds, we cannot go with short-term instruments. They don't fit the objectives. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust at this point has two primary objectives: climate transformation, moving to low carbon, climate resilient economy, and pandemic preparedness. On both, we rely very heavily on working with the World Bank first and foremost, but also with other development institutions, because what we have is we have knowledge around fiscal monetary policy, macro frameworks. We don't have sectoral knowledge, we do not have technical knowledge that these institutions have. So what we want is to align what we recommend and support financially with the objectives of the countries, first and foremost, but also with support of partners. We are aiming to start at 30 billion by October to have the RST to be operational. And we think that there is room to grow it 45, 50 billion, provided, of course, that we start, there is a pickup and it is successful. Quite a number of countries are interested to participate. We do have a requirement that the country has to have a program engagement with the fund, financial or non-financial, so we can anchor these longer-term policies into sound macro framework. Even with this condition, the interest is quite significant. Where we are on the fundraising, a very good number of countries have stepped forward and they said we would support it. I expect during the spring meetings to have announcements, but I can tell you during our board meetings, countries like France, Japan, China have made a fairly significant announcements of what they are seeking to commit. UK as well. And we do hope that the universe of participants is going to be quite broad. When we look at the teams to work on it, we want to have accelerated knowledge on these two issues, especially on climate. So very happy to say that today we launched our economics of climate change training program. We want to get our bread and butter economists to understand the policy framework so they can integrate it in Article 4. You know very well what it means. It means that then we can be credible in providing policy advice. So far, so good. The heroes are those who have worked on it from our strategy and policy department, from the finance department, from the legal department, and from the area departments, because to have a good design, you have to ground it in those who are dealing with programs with countries.
Well, thank you for that, and good luck in putting this in place and getting it to work. And with regard to the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, hopefully your biggest member is going to
Yes.
provide some financial support with some of those SDRs. Well, another issue that's very live, of course, is one that I think virtually every one of your members' central banks is looking at, the issue of digital currencies and the allied issue of fintech. Are you expecting much progress anytime soon? Some changes, some adaptations, or some adoptions or issuance of central bank digital currencies? And how is it going to affect the fund? And how is the fund going to aid its members in deciding what to do?
This is a hot topic in the world and at the fund. It is hot topic because the sheer speed with which digitalization is impacting the world of assets and money is lifting it up. We have today some $2 trillion in crypto assets. Crypto assets are unbacked. In this sense, they're not exactly money, they're actually not money, but they're an attractive investment where technology allows to offer a new product, and that tokenization of assets is way beyond money. What is within the universe of money are stable coins, e-money, the oldest way in which digitalization impacted financial transactions, and central bank digital currencies. On the issue of stable coins, what we see is, again, expansion, but not yet matching crypto assets expansion. So I can't give you an exact number. My colleagues are telling me maybe 200 billion, maybe it's moving a bit further. And these are, why are they not expanding very quickly? Because they're backed by assets. So you expect that a stable coin, it's really stable, can be exchanged one-to-one to fiat currency. For example, the US coin is guaranteed one-to-one. Now, some of the stable coins are less stable. The asset backing is not as secured, but because you need this asset backing, then the expansion is not as fast as with crypto assets. And then we go to central bank digital currencies. And again, quite amazing development. We surveyed our membership and we found out that over 100 countries are at some stage of investigating, piloting, and some already launching CBDCs. And these are big economies. We know China is on this list. We know India is on this list. We know the US has taken a decision to look into a digital dollar. So does the Eurozone. who are the first to cross the finish line? The Bahamas. And the Bahamas actually got their $1 just before they had a hurricane, and they can test in reality that it is helpful to have it for a country of multiple islands and difficulty to carry fiat currency from one place to another. For us at the fund, we have presented to our board of directors our digital money strategy. And it was very interesting. The countries that were very enthusiastic about it and extremely supportive, emerging markets, developing economies, mostly because of the leapfrogging opportunity they see, the need to continue to expand financial inclusion and using CBDCs for that purpose. The advanced economies were supportive, but less so, obviously, well-advanced financial systems and use of fiat currencies. What we provide to our membership, three things. One, analysis, including comparative analysis. We wrote a very thoughtful, very thorough paper comparing 6 countries at different stages of CBDCs. We offer capacity development. If you are interested, these are the skills you need. And we offer countries a chance to think through, support to think through. Why do they want it? What is the purpose? Before they decide on technology. We are very engaged on the issue of interoperability for CBDCs and very engaged on the issue of regulation for stable coins and for crypto assets. Because we think if CBDCs do not have built-in interoperability, there would be fragmentation. And if there is no regulation, then the stable coins and crypto assets can have higher risks and be actually more of a problem than of a support. So moving fast.
Indeed. Well, you grew up in Bulgaria, part of Comic-Con, so you know what a fragmented economic and financial world was like to live. Like you say, the challenge of the time, the fund was established to create a multilateral financial system, open and efficient and reliable and rules-based. And now all this is under challenge. You have a new team. You have a new first deputy managing director. You have a new economic counselor, and you have really top-rate colleagues in fiscal affairs, in the MCM. How are you going to take this high-powered team and, with the support of members, push for the fund's basic goals? Multilateral, open, rules-based system amidst all these difficulties.
You started by saying I lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I know what it is. I hated it. It was lonely and inefficient. And when I look forward, I really hope that we would find a way to prevent a fragmentation of that kind, a new Cold War that impacts our economies. I know that globalization has not served everybody. There are winners, there are losers. I know there are lessons we have to draw, and we have to make sure that what we offer to people is fairer, more transparent, more inclusive, that those who win have a better framework to share their benefits with those who do to lose. But it is a, phrase we often use in an environment like this: don't throw the baby with the bathwater. Well, that applies here so much. Look at what we have gained since I managed, and everybody around me, we all managed to move across the Iron Curtain. The world economy tripled since 1990. And the emerging markets, developing economies were the big beneficiaries. They increased 4.5 times. We saw shrinkage of poverty from 2 billion to what is still very high, 650 million, and they may have gotten more because of the last 2 years. But it is still a much, much more prosperous world. How to overcome the differences in value propositions, in objectives, in the way we see each other. It's not going to be at all easy. But I hope that an institution like the fund, we have a almost universal membership, 190 members, that we can build bridges. So on the big issues that affect the directions to travel for the world, we can come together. We can come together on tackling the food crisis, the risk of a debt crisis, the climate crisis, and find what unites us to be sufficiently strong to keep us functioning in a more integrated, coordinated fashion. Is this going to be possible? Well, it depends on determination. And I think of leaders, what would I tell them? I guess I would say, well, think what is best for your people. Is it best for your people to be in their block, isolated, culturally less diverse world and less prosperous world? Or it is better for your people that we find ways to build these bridges? You know, the Treasury Secretary of the US at the establishment of Bretton Woods said something really, really smart. He said, prosperity, like peace, is indivisible. So if we want this, we have to be indivisible ourselves. We have to act together.
Thank you for those words. I think we have time for just 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Emily Slater, our executive director, if you could step in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John, and thank you to the MD. We do have a couple of questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of summarize here. One question is on the IMF assistance to Ukraine. If you could elaborate a little bit further on what you're doing and how you can do more on a scale that will really be meaningful given the challenges. And then the second question is a continuation of this conversation around sort of decoupling and how do we promote the values of a rules-based system that were designed at Bretton Woods. And we talked a lot about this in our morning session as well. You know, you have spoken of a new Bretton Woods moment post-pandemic. And Secretary Yellen just this week gave a speech calling for a new Bretton Woods to really rethink the framework and the philosophies and to modernize the institutions to be fit for purpose going forward. So maybe if you could say a few words on how you are thinking about that.
Thank you for the questions. On the IMF support to Ukraine, let me first say that we have been engaged in Ukraine for a long time. We had a fairly effective program in place. We disbursed 800 million in December. We were about to disburse on the basis of completing a review when the war started. We also provided Ukraine with $2.7 billion of special drawing rights. They came very handy for the country. Because the work on the program was interrupted by brutal war, we moved to provide Ukraine with emergency financing, $1.4 billion. This is to keep the country in a position to support social services, the functioning of the economy. And we also have created a trust administered by the fund, where Canada has already deposited $1 billion as a guarantee to help Ukraine, and it's open to others if they are interested to contribute. Our main support for Ukraine goes through two channels. One, our team works very closely with the economic team of Ukraine on retaining macroeconomic and financial stability despite of the war. And I want to praise the Ukrainian economic team for doing a really good job in this regard. We want to, secondly, to recognize that even if the war goes on, there are parts of Ukraine that are not affected, where the economy can function, and it is important for Ukraine to receive support for building the country and keeping businesses functioning, even if the war is not quite yet over, and of course prepare the pathway for the rebuilding of the country. I had a very constructive, very good call with President Zelensky this weekend, and these were the two topics we talked about: how to make sure that macroeconomic stability is sustained, that the country doesn't slip into an inflationary spiral because of printing money to pay salaries, how we have that priority in mind, and then how we go about rebuilding the country, or continuing to build the country and build the governance of the country, build the competitiveness of the economy over time. I would put in parentheses, I have family in the second largest city of Ukraine, Kharkiv. It is bombed, but where they live, it is an area that has not been bombed yet. And they tell me that in this area that has been spared so far, they are cleaning the streets and even planting trees and flowers, just to convey that there is a country that cares of, the people that live there, that sense of we're not giving up on our lives. And I can tell you that really touched me a lot. Talking about, and by the way, there would be a meeting in Ukraine that the World Bank is hosting, and of course we will participate this week. On the question of decoupling and the risk of it, I mean, exactly because I lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I also know that we didn't share the same values and the same economic system. So how do you connect if that is absent? And therefore, the risk of decoupling, the risk of fragmentation comes if we are not able to build something that we all share. And what is it, the thing we need to build? Obviously, rule of law. So can we do it despite of some differences? Is that possible? I think risks are there, that it may be very, very difficult, but we should not give up on trying to find that anchor. What is best for people everywhere? And on a very personal note, I'm a big believer that when there is a will, there is a way, and that if we only have more women heads of states and prime ministers and presidents, maybe it would be easier to do.
Emily, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're at time now. So I very much appreciate you joining us today and being very generous with your time. It must be an incredibly busy week, even more so than normal, given the gravity of the challenges we've just discussed here. So thank you very much for joining us again, Managing Director John. As always, thank you for expertly moderating. And just want to remind our audience that our annual meeting will continue tomorrow afternoon at 3:15 p.m. With a conversation with World Bank President David Malpass and Bill Rhodes. So we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you once again to the Managing Director for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from Europe. And very good, early good.
Okay, Jessica will give me the signal, or Sarah will give me the signal, I assume. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's my privilege to have here with me today the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey. This is part of our Macro Week 2022 presentations of top economic policymakers, and we are fortunate to have Andrew as one of the exemplars of someone who's devoted his life to public service in the central banking and financial management community, and as someone who's thought deeply about the issues that we're all confronting today in the macroeconomic policy space. Andrew and I are going to have an on-the-record discussion of primarily monetary, but also, of course, financial and unavoidably international issues. For the UK, the international situation is always, of course, paramount. But in the current situation, where Andrew is a member of the G7 governors, the G20, and various other international working groups, his voice is all the more important. Andrew Bailey began his term as the governor of Bank of England just over 2 years ago in March 2020, just in time for the COVID pandemic. Prior to taking up that office, he served as chief executive officer of the Financial Conduct Authority from July 2016. That, of course, is one of the major supervisory entities in the United Kingdom and therefore in the global financial system. As CEO of the Financial Conduct Authority, Andrew was also a member of the Prudential Regulation Committee, the Financial Policy Committee, and the board of the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. Previously, he had been deputy governor at the Bank of Prudential Regulation and CEO of the Prudential Regulatory Authority from 2013 to 2016. He had a long career at the bank, including as an executive director, as governor's private secretary, I believe, to then Governor Eddie George, and head of the International Economics Division in Monetary Analysis, where I first had the privilege to get to know Andrew a long time ago now. So this is on the record, and we're privileged to have this conversation, and we will take it from there. So welcome back to the Peterson Institute, Governor.
Thanks, Adam. It's very good to be here.
It's obviously quite the set of international meetings and some of the
Yes.
first in-person ones, obviously, and you're wearing your solidarity with Ukraine badge.
Mm.
We know that you and several other Western or Democratic policymakers walked out of the G20. But we're going to start, I think, importantly, with inflation, particularly in the UK. That's, of course, your core mission at the bank.
Mm.
How should we think about the nature of inflation in the UK at present? I mean, if we oversimplify, we can see the US as primarily a demand overheating situation. The Euro area is primarily an energy shock. Obviously, there's more complexity in that. Does the UK fit into this framework? Is it a different nature of inflation there?
It's a really interesting question and a good starting point. I think the UK has some similarities with both the US and the Euro area and some important differences. I think you're right to characterize, as I would understand it, the US situation as more of a demand shock. The US is more insulated, certainly from the effects that we're seeing with natural gas prices, because of it having its own domestic supply. So, you know, the gas price and the natural gas price in the US is clearly disconnected from what's going on in Europe. So in terms of the shock that we're seeing at the moment, particularly, I would say we have far more in common probably with the Euro and the ECB in that sense, in the basic shock, because we're both, I think, seeing a very large terms of trade shock, which is already having and going to have very large real income effects. I think it's a pretty much unprecedented terms of trade shock that we're experiencing now, and increasingly that is focused on energy prices, as you said. There are other elements to it. I think there are at least two other elements to it. I think there's a core goods price element to it, and the US, I think, is seeing some of that. Indeed, you know, goods demand in the US has in many ways been sort of one of the drivers of that pattern in the world economy, and that's to some considerable degree, I think, a COVID legacy in some ways. I mean, I say legacy with a sort of hopeful optimism, because obviously COVID is still with us. But in many terms, in an economic sense, I think it has attenuated substantially. But we, like, you know, other economists, saw this, you know, this rebalancing of demand, or shift of demand from services to goods during the COVID period. It's not terribly surprising. And that contributed undoubtedly to the supply chain, the bottlenecks, the supply chain effects, and that's part of the supply story. The energy story is now the more dominant one. I think we're also, and it's interesting, I can tell you it's been quite a theme of the last few days at the meetings here. I mean, also concerned about what we're already seeing in some food prices, and a lot of concerns about what may be a consequence there, also bringing, I'm afraid, sadly, Ukraine into the picture again. So there's a common, the large common element with the euro area in that sense. Where there is a difference between us and the euro area, and a much greater similarities in the labour market. So we have a very tight labour market, again, coming out of COVID. And I think, you know, when I look at the US labour market, I see, these two labour markets have their differences, but there's quite a lot of similarity between the things we're seeing. I think both of us have come through COVID. I mean, there's a good news story in it, clearly. You know, we were all forecasting much higher unemployment during COVID, and because of the use of policy, primarily in the fiscal policy space, that did not happen. But it left us with a real dilemma, which I'm happy to come on and talk about, which was what exactly was going to happen to the labour market when that policy support came away. What we now know is that actually the labour market has gone on, you know, being very strong, and so we face that as part of the situation we face today. So we've got a big part of the euro story, but we've also got another part of the US story.
Could I ask you to expand a bit on the labor market? Because both in general, in the economic discussion, and particularly here at Peterson, we've been grappling with this. Our colleague Jason Furman and Olivier Blanchard have been doing their bit to try to piece through, Karen Dinan and others. And it's a little bit surprising to hear that the UK has had this sustained strong labor market, maybe because we're ignorant. But what role does Brexit play? Because there's obviously been a shift in and diminishment of migrant workers and immigration. What role, well, you mentioned policy, was there the kind of very large scale second round of fiscal stimulus in the UK that we saw in the US with the 21 American Rescue Package. I mean, just a little more if you could.
Happy to do that. Let's just start with the policy, the COVID sort of policy response, and then come on to the other elements of it. So the COVID policy response in the UK was much more focused on the furlough scheme, which was paying to keep people in jobs rather than paying people to be to go through unemployment. That was very successful. I mean, it was interesting for us. The scheme ended at the end of September last year. Yeah, obviously the economy was recovering by then. I think we, like other people, were surprised by how many jobs, it's important to say jobs because it was jobs actually rather than people, but obviously people are attached to those jobs, were furloughed right up to the last day. So around about 1 million jobs were furloughed up to the last day of the scheme.
And your workforce is roughly 25, 30 million?
Yeah, something in that order. So it was a much larger number than we'd expected. It begged the question for us, what was going to happen thereafter? Right. Interesting one for us because our forecasts of unemployment throughout last year, and I go back and look at the monetary policy reports of last year, were much lower than market forecasts. But we were wrong-footed by it in the sense that what happened was that you can barely see the end of the furlough scheme in the data, in the unemployment data. So unemployment, is now down under 4%. And that's, of course, a big success in terms of that policy. Now, you asked about the other elements of it. I would pick out a number in the UK. One, I think, that is interesting because there is a parallel, I think, with the US, is that we have seen a lower level of labour force participation. Yeah. A year ago, that was focused in two areas. One was younger people who were staying in education longer. No great surprise there. We've seen that in previous recessions, and that has actually now come off quite a lot. The second one was older workers dropping out of the labour force into inactivity, which of course is those who don't have a job and are not searching for one. And that seems to be somewhat paralleled in the US. Well, I can see. Although I think the ages are sort of. Yeah, we're talking more about people in the 60s, probably a bit older in the US, but that's a difference in the labour market. Interestingly, seems to be more in the UK, more men than women. And just to bring in another dimension, which I think again is a common dimension on the COVID thing, because we've also had an increase in unexpected saving, not evenly distributed in the labour force. But I bring that in now because it begs the question for us with the pattern on participation, which is what is going to happen on that front next? And it's to paint two sort of broad scenarios which lead to different outcomes. One is a scenario where people have got unexpected saving, they're going to live off it for a period of time and then come back into the labour force. Mm-hmm. Or another is, and this is obviously older workers we're talking about now, they're going to reevaluate their future and decide to retire somewhat earlier than they would have done had COVID not happened. Obviously, that will have very different labour market consequences. We don't know is the answer, I think. Right. The two other pieces of the story for us, one of which you mentioned. So the first one is that we've had an increase in public sector employment in the UK. I think more of it than not is associated with health services. Some of that we expect to come off because it's things like test and trace and all around that. But it's been quite noticeable. And then the last one, as you said, is what is the size of the labour force? Mm-hmm. And again, it's hard to know in the UK because the survey that records it hasn't been done during the COVID period. But we think on our best estimate is that the labour force is smaller than it would otherwise have been, and that is a migration story. Right. Now, I'll just add one further focus, and I will probably come to it later. I immediately, whenever I say this, get asked, well, is it COVID or is it Brexit? The answer is it's almost impossible to work that one out.
No, I kind of expected that. So, I mean, there are a number of things I could follow up on, but I'll be like the others. What is it, just to the degree objectively the bank has done analysis, can be said about Brexit's effect on the British economy? I mean, concerns for employment in the City of London, concerns for capital flows, for productivity, or is it all just, it's so conflated with COVID, you guys, not guys, you and your colleagues just are unable to discern the various threats?
Well, split it out into sort of the monetary policy domain and the sort of financial services / financial stability domain. So on the monetary policy side, I think there are two things, one of which we've mentioned already, which is the labour force. I think the labour force is smaller than I mean, you know, you remember the MPC.
Yes.
You know, one of the great privileges of my job and the fun elements of it was to go and visit with our regional agents, businesses around the country. I do a lot of it. I get around all 12 of them every year.
Wow.
And it is interesting. I mean, when you go on these visits, I've done 2 or 3 recently where I do, as I'm sure you did, we do business roundtables as well as visiting individual businesses. And yeah, the labour market is the first, second, and third thing they want to talk about, and recruitment challenges. And they do talk about the shortfall in migrant labour that they're experiencing. Quite a few of them do. I went to a dairy farm recently, and they were very clear in setting out the problems they were having on that front. So again, but attributing causation to Brexit and COVID is right. Really, you can't do it at the moment. Turning to trade, I think there's no question that we've seen a fall in trade with the EU. But this, of course, is in line with what we were expecting. Right. I mean, we were expecting a pattern of a fall in trade, and then over, as the sort of the economics would tell us, a rebalancing of trade outside the over quite a elongated period of time. And so I think, our conclusion at the moment is we've not seen anything that causes us to change our mind on that basic pattern. To then turn over to the financial side of things. Now that's where that's interesting. We haven't seen the job transfers, I should say, that people were predicting on sort of, early days in sort of summer of 2016. I mean, the numbers we tend to hear sort of added up are sort of in the sort of mid-thousands, 5,000-7,000 range. I think what I would say is, I mean, it's not over as a story. I think that's important to put in mind. London, as you know, is a global financial centre. It's not a regional financial centre. It's a global financial centre. We are very much, open for business. We're very clear that 2 things. One is that we're not lowering regulatory standards. 2, that as authorities, as regulatory authorities, as a central bank, we maintain close working relationships with our fellow authorities in the continent of Europe, as we do with the US and anywhere else, indeed. And nothing has changed in that respect. It's a close working relationship. It is not an antagonistic working relationship. But I would say this. I mean, I think probably the sort of the best example of this is the whole issue of central clearing. Mm-hmm. I understand where the EU are. I mean, they've moved into a longer phase of wanting to achieve a reordering of it. I would, however, say what I always say is, look, there are benefits to having global centres. There are costs to fragmentation, which I think are clear. We're open for business. We're happy to work with authorities. And frankly, we have not yet seen any argument for why that should change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me take you back, Governor, if I could, into the realm of monetary policy and inflation.
No.
The textbook, as you and I both know well, the textbook response to a supply shock, like an energy shock, is the Monetary Policy Committee is supposed to let the first round effects go through and only tighten if you start getting into the second round effects, however you define those. So both, how does that, does that textbook apply to the energy shocks you're seeing in the UK right now, but also more generally going forward? Let's imagine, let us wish that there is a ongoing set of upward shocks to carbon prices, say. I realize it's a very different question, but under the same sort of heading, if we're going to see sustained increases in carbon prices in order to save the planet, how should monetary policy respond to that? Does it need to adapt?
Well, I think the textbook is clearly the right framework to start with. There's no question about that. And indeed, I would say that when there was a lot of discussion last year about sort of transient inflation from supply shocks, this is sort of pre-Ukraine now, obviously, this was connected with supply chain bottlenecks in the COVID period. That word transience was very much with that in mind. And people often ask me, well, what do you mean by that? And my view is, well, there isn't, I'm not going to give you a fixed, it's X number of days. I think the way we look at it is to say it's got to be connected with the transmission, what we assume to be the sort of the transmission period of monetary policy, which of course in itself is not fixed. So that's the sort of the starting framework, and I think it remains the starting framework, and nothing's changed in that respect. Then I think you have to layer on two things, or two or three things. We are now in a period, sadly, of unprecedentedly large shocks. Moreover, we're in a period, and this is possibly the bigger point actually, we're in a period where we've had shock after shock after shock. Right. We've had the COVID shocks, and now we've got the energy shock really coming out of the appalling things that Russia's doing in Ukraine. Now, nothing changes the framework, but of course I think when we think about the importance of the nominal anchor of the inflation target and how we return inflation to the target, we have to ask ourselves the question, does the fact that we're getting shock after shock affect confidence in the nominal anchor and in the policy framework? And therefore the sort of the textbook has to be modified in that respect, because we have to respond more, because people, and you can understand why, are saying, well, hang on a minute. Right.
It's a new
said
excuse.
This was transient.
Right.
And now you've got this, well, yeah, but then there's another shock.
Right.
And of course, we have to be very sensitive to how people respond to that. So that's the first point. And then the second point, of course, is also straight out of the textbook as well, which then is to say, well, layering onto that sort of first round supply shock is the risk of second round effects. Now, so I'm not, we're about to start our round of monetary policy committee policy meetings, so I'm not going to, nothing I say should be a speculation on, because we genuinely don't. We deliberate. You're a former member, we deliberate in the room.
Yeah.
But but I think it's helpful to lay out the framework, and of course, very important in our thinking is, taking us back to the labour market for a moment, particularly, well, is this combination of supply shocks and a tight labour market going to give us more of a problem with second round effects? Right. We think that the real income shock and the scale of this real income shock is going to cause a slowdown in growth. I think there's every reason to think that. And that's what we set out in February and when we did the last monetary policy report. But the question is, of course, is the labour market going to slow down? And it's, I can tell you, Adam, it's interesting, again, going around the country talking to businesses. They see right up front the problems of recruiting at the moment, recruiting labour, recruiting people to work. And we have to ask ourselves the question, well, is that going to cause the labour market to be stronger for longer, notwithstanding a decline in growth? Because there may well come a point where people decide they're going to hoard labour.
Right. It's very complicated, Andrew. Sorry, but just to repeat, you also, your term is 8 years, but also, of course, you and your colleagues are thinking for the long term. Do you think there should be changes to the inflation targeting regime if we're seeing, energy is a big part of the consumer basket, and that's going to be going up in price for a long time? Does that change things, or does it change your target series, or does it not matter?
Well, I think just on the energy points, I think we should sort of separate two things out there. Energy prices are today, of course, at unprecedentedly high levels. It's quite a discussion I had with a colleague on a Friday afternoon about 2 months ago, I think it was, where this was talking about the natural gas price. And I said, it's 8 times its long run average, but it's half what it was on Monday. Something like that. I can't remember exactly.
Right,
this is
something
crazy.
like
But
that.
we're living in a period of very high volatility now. Of course, sadly we don't know, what's going to happen in Ukraine. But I think it's critically important that we support the Ukrainians. Really, happy to talk about that if you want. But I do expect that, there will, energy prices will, revert to their more normal levels. I mean, that history would tell us that
Right.
does happen. And then take your second point and layer it on. Yes, but you say, but what about the longer term shift to away from fossil fuels? And how does monetary policy accommodate that? I think the important thing to say at the moment, I think for us, is that the inflation target is a critical nominal anchor for us.
Right.
I reject any commentary that it's failed. It hasn't failed. Actually, what it's now going through is its most severe test since it was created over 25 years ago or so. So more than ever, we need it. I think probably one of the differences I would observe is between sort of UK and some other central banks is, we're an open economy. So some of the adjustments we've made to the inflation targeting framework were designed to reflect that. So we're much more, I think, conscious of this this trade-off position that we're in at the moment in a severe way, and we've adjusted over time the language around the inflation target to sort of create sensible flexibility for the sort of the return to target for inflation. And that makes sense in our world. Wouldn't be so obvious in a less open economy, probably. So, I think those have been sensible adjustments, and it's important we keep all that stuff under review. Now, the climate point is interesting because, again, you're right. I mean, in one sense, the framework should accommodate it. The question is, how's it going to happen?
Exactly.
On which, by the way, I think and this is quite a focus now. We have to do a lot more work on the macroeconomics of that side of things.
No, and I agree. And our colleague here at Peterson, John Pisani-Ferry, did a piece about 6 months ago starting down that path. And we agree with you. I wasn't expecting you to have the answer today, although I would have been nice if you did. But it's something we do have to think about.
It's interesting, I think, that, I'm not surprised. I mean, the work that we started, Mark Carney started in the Bank of England on climate change was actually had its origin in the regulatory side.
Right.
Actually had its origin in the insurance regulation because on the sensible point that they're holding very long-term assets, so the horizon is relevant. What's become, I think, increasingly apparent and where we're turning to, and it's interesting what you were saying about John Pisani-Ferry's work, is that we've got to shift that focus more towards this understanding the macroeconomic dynamics of
exactly.
transition.
It's fascinating. Continuing in sort of wonky monetary policy world, where, Andrew, I'm proud to be part of the community, I guess. You mentioned a couple times the idea, the fundamental idea of the inflation target as your nominal anchor. And one of the things that has been much discussed is how low long bond rates, not just gilts, but treasuries, bonds, obviously, have remained. And even though, of course, the 10-year, the 30-year treasury are up quite a lot, again, in real terms, they're still very low. And in nominal terms, these are hardly multi-year highs. How much comfort should we take from that? And when I was at the bank, and since then, the Bank of England has, I wouldn't say relied on, but made a lot out of five-year forwards and various surveys. How comfortable are you in this environment that these measures of inflation expectations are reasonably good proxies for what inflation expectations actually are?
Well, I think what we're seeing is, and the UK there's a few specifics to the UK here. So I think with short-run inflation expectations are increasing rapidly, but that doesn't surprise us because they tend to reflect the sort of obviously the current read, as it were. Looking at it's the medium term that is, as you said, is more relevant. Now, unfortunately, in the UK at the moment, we've got sort of what I might call statistical noise because there's a rebasing of the RPI index going to come in the early part of the next decade. And so it's already beginning to sort of give us some problems reading the data. But if you strip through it, I would say, yes, we are seeing some increase. We don't think it amounts to a de-anchoring. particularly when we look at what I call the distribution of expectations, there's some interesting work being done on that, which we've used and developed ourselves, which I think has given us, some support for thinking that if you look at the distribution, you're not seeing a fundamental change. But what I would say is I think it's critical in our position now to say none of that should make us complacent.
Right.
Because as I said earlier, I mean, this is the biggest test of the framework that it's had. And our ability, as we are committed to doing, to get inflation back to target is going to be the key thing there. And I understand why people are saying, well, you're really going to do it. Well, yes, we are, but I can understand with inflation where it is, and unfortunately, what is yet to come.
Right.
Why we get those questions.
I mean, as you know, and again, I'm not going to ask you to comment on the U.S. monetary policy, obviously, but as you know, we've been having a very parallel discussion here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And some of my Peterson colleagues, Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, who were out in front a year ago saying the Fed was underestimating inflation in its forecast. They, particularly Olivier and Larry, have been explicit in saying they don't think the currently priced in and announced amount of tightening the Fed's going to do is going to be enough. They think you have to go well past neutral and actually start raising unemployment to get inflation down. Again, not asking you to comment on the US, but just sort of how do you, as a sitting governor, think about that? How do you decide, how far to go in this tightening cycle?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to comment on the US, except to say, as we were discussing earlier, that the shock is different.
Right.
And that, of course, changes the framework somewhat of looking at it. And I think what I will say for us is that I think and this really repeats what we said in the February monetary policy report and the March MPC minutes. Yeah, we are now walking a very tight line between tackling inflation and the output effects of the real income shock, and the risk that could create a recession and push us too far down in terms of inflation. Because it's interesting to look at the forecast that we produced in the February report, which has inflation coming down to target and back down to target somewhere bit into year 3. And that was based on as we have a conditioning assumption which holds energy prices pretty constant. If you, as we published in that report, if you use the market curves for energy prices, we had inflation coming down below target.
Yeah.
So we are walking this very, very fine line now between these two things. And I think what I would say, and as this is sort of a typical central banker's comment, I know, we have to reassess that at every meeting. Right. I mean, that certainly is our position. We just, we have to keep coming back to that at every meeting and saying, what have we learned since we last sat in this room? As you know, there's only one thing that's entirely predictable with the MPC, that there's always another meeting.
Right. It is a bit of a treadmill.
One thing is certain.
So within that, to get into very nitty-gritty policy, the Fed has essentially announced their rough approximation of where they think neutral is. And this comes, the neutral interest rate, or R star.
Yeah.
This comes, I know for the audience.
Yeah.
But this comes, of course, a year and a half after the framework review in the U.S. and a couple of years after Chair Powell's famous "Don't Trust the Stars" Jackson Hole speech, I guess roughly 4 years ago. Again, not asking you to comment on Chair Powell's remarks, but the MPC, you all seem to have been very forward guidance on some things, like when you hit 1%, you're going to do certain things with the balance sheet. But as far as I can tell, reading the comments, you've stayed away from offering an estimate of R star or of neutral. So just could you talk through what you see as the pros and cons of being more explicit or less explicit about your expectations for R star as a
Well, I think, first of all, I would say R star actually, I think, is an important sort of part of the sort of foundation of our thinking, more so than neutral rate, I would say, in that sense. So R star the more sort of cyclical neutral rate, that is. I mean, R-star is an important sort of structural foundation. And the sort of the drivers of it, I mean, the story about sort of global population productivity and saving, I think, our general view would be we don't see those changing, radically in the foreseeable future. So that's an important sort of, if you like, grounding. I think for us at the moment, I think talking about a neutral rate in a point when there's a trade-off problem is not, I think, the most useful thing we can do. So I think it's not surprising there's probably some difference there in terms of how we sort of think about it and communicate the position on where we are on policy. I think it's also important that given this trade-off problem, we don't become sort of fixated on one particular interpretation of how it will play out, because I think this is the other problem. I mean, you mentioned forward guidance. I mean, the reason that I am, if anything, more nervous about giving forward guidance, I'll put the quantitative tightening thing into a different, slightly different bucket for the moment, is that the world is so uncertain. If you live in a world as we do, where one of your core energy prices can fall 20% in one afternoon, as it did last week, you sort of feel pretty humble about the amount of guidance you can give on where policy is going to go.
Thank you for being forthright about how you're seeing these things. I mean, that's part of the reason we're glad to have you, governors, to try to give that kind of sense of how one thinks about these things. You mentioned a couple times now the idea that the inflation targeting framework in the UK hasn't failed, but this is the biggest test it's had in the 25 years, or rather 30 years of inflation targeting, 25 years of independent MPC. Obviously, as I've written about and you lived, the Bank of England was one of the leaders in setting up this regime, and it's since many other economies have had similar regimes. Several of those economies, including the US, Australia, Canada, ECB, have done reviews of their framework in recent years. And they did them, it so happened, right in the run-up to COVID. Just thinking more broadly, how fit for purpose do you see the inflation targeting regime in general, or the Bank of England specifically, going forward? I mean, do you have the shocks of the last few years, or the political economy of the last few years, changed anything in your views about how the regime should be structured?
I think in general, I think it remains absolutely as critical to us as it has done, as you said, over, 25 years of the current version, but 30 years if you sort of take it's the sort of the run-in period. I think it has great advantage of being clear. I mean, there's nothing simple about the analytics, as you know very well, that underpin it, but it's a very clear anchor. It's a clear communication device, and it's a clear framework, and I think that is a huge advantage. Now, as I was saying earlier, it has been modified over time around the language, and sensibly so, I think, not least because we've had, I think, in 25 years of the MPC, we've had two, it's a game of two halves, as they say. I mean, the first half was, relatively benign. The second half has been anything but, and seems to be still on a course. And so, I think it's absolutely right that in that second half there have been modifications to it. I mean, what I would say is, I think it's interesting to compare our situation with some of the other central banks. Again, coming to this point, we are an open economy. I mean, when the US did its review, obviously we followed it very closely. One thing I would observe is, and I don't think we're that, I mean, obviously we've got inflation well above target at the moment, but I don't think we're over the long run we're that far off. That inflation since the global financial crisis in the UK has not been far off target on average. Right. So we didn't start with the question, I think, that the Fed started with. We were not in that place. And I think then it's interesting to ask the question, well, why was that the case? And I come back to the point I made earlier. I think there are different dynamics in an open economy in that sense. I mean, you've got obviously different influences on it. I don't think that in an open economy, and I'm not convinced that an averaging methodology would be one that we could easily transport into an open economy. I think it would get very complex, saying, well, you may remember the exchange rate depreciated sort of 2 years ago, and so you've got to offset that thing that happened 2 years ago, and I think it would just get too complicated at that point.
Yeah, I wasn't advocating.
No, I know you're not. I mean,
Yeah, okay, that's cool. Just continuing on that. So several years ago, on this very stage, Ben Bernanke at a Rethinking Macroeconomic Policy conference that Olivier and Larry organized, Ben Bernanke and co-authors offered a paper about dealing with the effective lower bound on interest rates for monetary policy that you might automatically kick in with fiscal policy. And then a couple of years later, also pre-COVID, Stanley Fischer and a few of his co-authors from BlackRock made an even more strong proposal about sort of an automatic fiscal capacity for central banks when you run up against the zero lower bound or effective lower bound. Just again, more generally, not asking you to address those specific proposals, there was a lot of talk pre-COVID about having to have new regimes or rules for fiscal monetary cooperation in order to avoid the worst of the effective lower bound problem. After COVID, we've seen pretty agile, very large scale fiscal policy in response to a shock. Where do you think this debate should be going now, or is it moot now that we've seen that fiscal policy can react this way?
Well, I think as you say rightly, I think it's important that fiscal policy has demonstrated, sort of rediscovered itself in that sense, and I think and that's obviously in several countries, including the UK, and I think that's important and welcome. I mean, I will, however, say this. I mean, I think I'm very sensitive about this sort of coordination word, because it gets certainly in the UK, it gets overinterpreted. I mean, we do not sit down with the Treasury. I do not sit down with the Chancellor and say, well, if you did this, I'll do that, sort of thing like that. Those discussions just don't happen. On the other hand, of course, they are, and I think this is what was underpinning your commentary, is that they are consistent. Mm-hmm. Particularly in the sort of situations we've had with things like COVID. I mean, it'd be pretty odd if they weren't consistent, frankly, at that point, given the shock we were experiencing. And that's important. And so it's important, to be able to sort of look across the field. As you know, I mean, our convention in the MPC is that we take announced government policy as gospel and plug it in, as it were, and off we go. And we don't second guess what the government's going to do. We don't think they should do something else and stick it in the forecast. And so, I think the system works pretty well. I think, therefore, as you say, there was never, I can honestly say, in the UK, any discussion of certainly the outbreak of COVID, when, interestingly, Rishi Sunak and I were both sort of 2 weeks into the jobs. Right. He was 4 weeks and I was 2. We had no conversation along those lines, and I think it's very appropriate that we didn't. We did, of course, then have to look at other tools, though, and that's where the debate's really been in our case, is what's in the toolkit. And I would sort of pick out 2 things there. I mean, one was the whole debate around quantitative easing, and the second one is the debate around negative interest rates, which seems pretty moot now. I mean, it seems like a bit of history, a bit of ancient history now, but I mean, it was obviously a live debate. In a toolkit sense, I should say, not in an actual policy implementation sense, but in a toolkit sense.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm going to ask you in our remaining time to say some things about financial stability, and then about the response to Ukraine, at least the aspects that fall under your remit. And I shouldn't say response to Ukraine, response to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So in the first, on financial stability, given your background and in this area, what if sanctions continue, and again, not just for Russia, but if this becomes an ongoing tool, part of the toolkit for foreign policy, say, does that present financial stability risks? Does that present different concerns that bank supervisors and other financial regulators should take into account? Or is it, I mean, again, one takes it as gospel, the foreign policy gods speak, and you, the central banker, accept it. But just sort of thinking longer term, if financial sanctions of this scale, this magnitude, are recurring or at least threatened, how does that change the financial landscape?
So that's a really interesting question. In many ways, it's, to my mind, been a question that has been running throughout the discussions we've had this week in the spring meetings, because I think it raises a critical set of questions, which I'd really put under the heading of resilience. So let's start with the good news. The banking system is not a problem in this respect.
Right.
Throughout COVID and now throughout, as we sadly are in the Ukrainian situation, the resilience of the banking system has stood up. I mean, I hope I'm not jinxing it at this point, but I really don't think so. I mean, I think it is the post-crisis, the post-global financial crisis reforms have, in a sense, demonstrated, if we ever doubted it, which we didn't, but I mean, they've demonstrated they were for real, as it were. But I think what it's done is then point to resilience in other aspects of the system where you can't tell the same story.
Right.
So I think we can start with the supply chain issue, because interestingly, I mean, we had a very cut down form of the annual meetings here, back in, when it was October, before Ukraine was obviously on the horizon. And even then we were talking about the resilience of supply chains in the context of COVID. That has become much more acute now, obviously. So the resilience of supply chains, I would say, I think a second area allied to it is what I would call commodity financing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, when I look at the last 2 months from a financial stability point of view, a lot of positives, particularly around some of the, the core of the system that we've dealt with over the last decade. There is no doubt. I mean, the system has been, strained in the last 2 months, but the core of the system's come nowhere near to breaking, in my view. I think, however, we did have a period early on where there was a lot more strain in what I would call commodity financing. Mm-hmm. It's a much more opaque area of the financial system, and that's not, news in a way. I mean, it's reflection of it's got many facets to it that the system has. But if you look at even at the sort of core energy markets, right, it's a more opaque system. I think we got into areas where, to give you a more technical sort of example, the way in which margins were being calculated, particularly in OTC markets, perfectly sensibly done, by the way, clearly risk had gone up substantially. But one of the things that worried me was whether we were going to see a break in the markets where OTC margins were going up, and the banks that were often calling those margins were then the people who were having the margins called in the sort of commodity financing world were saying to the banks, "Well, I need credit from you to give you the margin that you're demanding," and that's just there was a risk that we got a break in the system at that point when the bank said, "Well, my risk tolerance says that it's the right margin, but my risk tolerance says I'm not going to lend to fund you for that margin." Well, it didn't happen, but I think we got too close to it happening to be comfortable. And of course, that has both real economy effects, as we're seeing with commodities, and it has financial stability effects. So there are big areas of resilience around, say, these supply chains around commodity markets, which we've now got to focus on. Because I think it's told us that while we've achieved a lot in the banking system, we haven't, there are areas we haven't come to, which have now been sort of put under the spotlight.
Speaking of some of those, I mean, one thing that gets a lot of hype is the private cryptocurrencies, cybercurrencies of that type. And for some of them, their stated value proposition is we're libertarian ideals. We look at the US and others expropriating individual oligarchs or Russian people. The whole point is we get you out from that. And I, as a former central banker, look at this and say, well, hell yeah, if you're violating sanctions, we should be shutting you down. Or if you're enabling people to violate sanctions. Again, so in your discussions or in discussions at the working level below you, I mean, is this a change moment in how the international financial authorities are looking at some of these cyber currencies, or were you already managing to section them off?
No, it's a big issue. So it's a big issue in the Financial Stability Board. I mean, first of all, to your very good point, I mean, I'm afraid, you know, there's a very clear message to the sort of, as you say, those who take the more libertarian view, that you haven't actually created a separate world,
Right?
which is outside the sort of the influence of states. I mean, that has not happened.
Right.
You know, and it's interesting, as you say, when you get people, I hear people saying, well, you know, Russian sanctions shouldn't apply in the crypto world because we're in a different part of the world. Well, no, you're not. I mean, I'm afraid that's not how it is. So that, I mean, that must be a clear point. I mean, I think, I mean, I've, you know, long been associated with being somebody who's made some quite strong statements about unbacked crypto, particularly that it doesn't have intrinsic value. Right. Which doesn't mean to say it doesn't have value, because people want it as
Yeah, no, intrinsic value.
Intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. But I think, you know, just to give you a sense as to where the work is focused, I mean, it's really focused in three parts, but they have to come together. So one is the unbacked crypto world, and what are the right set of, you know, what is the right level of regulatory protection that world needs to expect, and what impact could it have on broader financial stability? Because it's growing rapidly. I mean, our general comment is it may not be a financial stability issue today, but it could be tomorrow. The second area is so-called stable coins. Right. Stable being a term of art. And particularly there, I mean, are these, whereas I don't see unbacked crypto as being money as a medium of exchange. I think it is a store of value question far more. Stable coins, of course, are attempting to be a medium of exchange. We spent quite a lot of time in the Banking and Financial Policy Committee on the question of, therefore, what standards do we expect? You know, as I think, you know, some of my colleagues in the US say, some of these stable coins are not very good quality money market funds, actually, at the moment, purporting to be something else. And, you know, that's clear an issue. And of course, that then quickly transfers into the issue of central bank digital currency.
Yes.
And what its future is. The third leg of the work is so-called decentralized finance, which of course is really sort of another, you know, set of sort of tools for sort of putting the crypto world to use. And I think the fascinating question there is, I think what one of the drivers in that world is an attempt to use artificial intelligence to, and if you like, sort of control finance. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, obviously, I'm not against AI at all. But I think it's a challenge to regulators, because regulators essentially operate on the basis of identifying the institution that is responsible for the thing they want to regulate and sticking their hook into it, basically, and saying, we're regulating you and this is what we're doing. And I think decentralized finance is probably an attempt to sort of try to evade that. And you get into a very sort of philosophical question about, well, could you have anything, you know, which is AI, which doesn't have a controlling mind behind it? Whether or not, I mean, my sort of guess is the answer is no at the end of the day, but they're going to make it hard on the way, as it were, because they're going to make it less obvious where the sort of financial activity is how and where it's being controlled.
Thank you for taking us through that from the mind of somebody who's at the FSB and talking about these issues. So we're getting near the end of our time. We have another few minutes. And again, I want to thank Governor Bailey for being with us here at the Peterson Institute during Macro Week and taking us through the logic behind some of his decisions and his colleagues' decisions and going forward, more importantly. So picking up on what you were saying about central bank digital currencies, and obviously the Bank of England has been doing a lot of work on this, both research work and practical work for quite some time. Putting it crudely, what is the use case for a central bank digital currency?
This is a great question.
Yeah, and does it matter whether does the Bank of England need to have one if the ECB has one, or vice versa? Does the Bank of England not need to have one if the ECB has one, and things like that?
I mean, it's the fundamental question. I mean, it's often put in terms of, so exactly what problem are you trying to solve?
Right.
And indeed, you know, the House of Lords in Britain produced a report, the Economic Affairs Committee, saying a solution in search of a problem, I think, was something rather like that. And it does occupy a lot of our time. So, and we in the government haven't taken a decision, we're not near to take a decision yet on whether we're going to do central bank digital currency. But it's a useful sort of framework for thinking about the answer. So I could sort of dismiss quite a few things. I don't think it's particularly about the efficiency of the domestic payment system. I think we've all seen a lot of innovation in that area. There is an issue there's a big issue about cross-border payments. Right. But if that was the only issue, we would, I think, design something very different. It's not about the end of cash. That, you know, we're not giving up on cash. As long as the public want it, we'll provide it. I think that's where other central banks are as well. So I think, and I think I said this to the House of Lords actually, I think the real question for me is what I sometimes call the Facebook question, or Meta as it knows, is if there is a real demand for, you know, these alternative stable digital coins, right, but we have real concerns about their sort of stability, is at the end of the day the better answer to say, no, we will produce the digital currency, right, and you can use ours, right, rather than create your own. Now, we're not near to, say, concluding on that, but personally, in my own mind, I think that is the sort of the nub of the issue for me when I come down to it is, if digital currency is in and of itself something that, you know, has a future, then would it be better for it to be private? But I'll just finish by saying, we put a paper out last June, I think it was. It does create very big issues for both monetary policy and potentially for monetary policy and financial stability in the following sense, which we need to think through to see how big they are. If it shifts the balance of demand between central bank money and commercial bank money, right, or inside money, outside money, in a sort of Friedman and Schwartz sort of framework, then we really need to think through the implications of that. Because I am, and I say this without wishing to be a Luddite, because I'm not, the thinking on the technology has run ahead of the thinking on the economics, right, in that sense. And we need to correct that.
Very important. So finally, another hot topic that comes up in markets and the pundits, and perhaps has even entered the hallowed spring meetings, is that in addition to the Western or democratic response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the financial sanctions, in addition to incentivizing some people to look at private currencies, there's also a question of, does this incentivize state actors to think about, oh, I want to hold my central bank reserves differently, not in dollars, not in things that can get bottled up, or I want to have a payment system that doesn't run through SWIFT or something like that. How much is that, do you think, a real concern? And is that showing up at all in discussions of international financial architecture or G20, these issues of wanting an alternative to the US dollar under sanctions?
I think, let me sort of split it into two parts, because I just wanted to say at the beginning, because I think it's important to, in a sense, preface any remark with this. What Russia is doing in Ukraine is appalling, which is why I and others, you know, walked out on, right, the Russian finance minister yesterday. I'm afraid it's appalling, and I think it's important that they understand that, and I'll use this, an emotional word, I know to use this word, particularly in history. You know, we are not, you know, in my view, and I'm central banker, so I'm not a politician, there should be no appeasement of Russia because we have to deal with economic problems as a consequence of what's going on. We just roll our sleeves up and deal with those. Right. You know, that's the right thing to do. Hard though it can be at times, that's what we're here for as public officials, and we just get on with it, frankly. There can be no appeasement in that sense. And I think the reason I say at the beginning is because, yes, I think we do have to reinforce the message, and it has been said, you know, many times in the meetings this week, you know, that, of course, you know, it will be damaging if there is fragmentation. It will be damaging if there is a setback to free trade. And we have to make the case more strongly for why that is not the right answer. It's the wrong answer. And we'll do that, I'm sure. I mean, I was very interested, in some of the meetings where I think trade has become, if I'm going to be positive about it, is put trade more onto the agenda than it was. It has sunk too far off the agenda, and it's coming more up the agenda. So fragmentation is the wrong answer. I think those who think they will do it, I think are going down the wrong road. But we have to, we're going to have to make the case once again. I mean, these issues keep coming around, sadly.
Well, it's a great note to end on because it combines your moral vision and your public service. It's also a great note to end on because, frankly, that is, of course, what the Peterson Institute is devoted to, is trying to make the case for when and how we should limit free commerce and free finance to what public goods when. And so on behalf of our audience globally and the Peterson Institute, thank you for sharing so much with us today.
Pleasure to have the opportunity to talk.
This was Governor Andrew Bailey of the Bank of England speaking at Macro Week 2022 at the Peterson Institute. Of course, his remarks and all the remarks of our speakers are available permanently on our website. Some of them, in this case, perhaps by the Bank of England, have been streamed by other sources and are available. And we will conclude tomorrow with European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde speaking at 9 a.m. Eastern. Thank you, Governor Bailey.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay, I think we're out.